That's my dad. Doesn't he have a kind face? This is after he retired, a photo taken by the Eugene Register Guard. But I think that's why he was such a popular physician, because, people trusted their doctor. He was just a good man, and would smile at people when they're stressed out or sick well, it'll be okay. Let's do this and let's try this. He was an exceptional physician. Much of what I'm going to describe tonight are from his memoirs. Dad took a class called Memoirs class at Lane Community College, and it just, was a class offered, and he was retired and looking for things to do. And it just, over that time of taking that class and just writing down little vignettes as they came to him, and that's what they said, just write the stuff that you remember. And later worry about what order it should be. And then he compiled it in what became 2 volumes. The first one given to all of us kids and grandkids on his 80th birthday. He did that. That was his gift to us on his 80th birthday. But these have just become treasures to us. I mean, there's stories of all childhoods, silly things he did in college, and career things, friends, his marriage, to our amazing mom, and 63 years of marriage. So it's all that too. But he also talks about his engagement in alcohol and alcoholism and the impact on his family. But the first one, so it's kind of nice. Dad gets to tell his own story to you tonight through his words. I'll be reading a lot of this. But there's a precious memory that I want to share first, and this is the first photo he remembers ever being taken of him when he was 3 years old. It was St. Patrick's Day, and his parents must have dressed him up like a leprechaun, and they had just got a new car, Model A or Tin Lizzie, and they put him up on the car. So there he is. My first recollection is having a picture taken in my St. Patrick's Day outfit, standing on the hood of our new car, age 3. And when I was looking at this, it hit me. This photograph was taken on St. Patrick's Day exactly 100 years ago today. So I went and told that to Tom and said, "Oh, this talk it's a God thing, it's the right time." So anyway, there he is. And much of the story that you're going to hear tonight is about his father. My grandfather, A.B. Kerns, Dr. Albert Benedict Kerns, he was a dentist. And I'm not sure if this picture is inside or outside, because I think, if the weather was nice, the lighting in the 30s or the 20s, outdoors you're going to get a better view. But we don't know who the patient is, poor guy. But this is about our grandfather, who, as you'll hear, we never met. We never had a chance to meet him. And most of this story is about him, and that kind of became a catalyst. What happened to my grandfather became a catalyst for a lot of important things in my father's life. But A.B. was from a big Irish Catholic family, 8 kids, and he grew up in Auburn, Nebraska. The family homestead's still there. Irish immigrants, his father, so it'd be my great-grandfather, was born here, but everybody else in the family was born in Ireland and came over during the potato famine. So, but Ireland also has problems with alcoholism. You may not be aware of this, but when kids get to confirmation age in Ireland, it's common that some will choose to take what they call the pledge, and they'll become a pioneer. And what that refers to is recognizing all the harm that's been done through alcoholism to the Irish people. And of course, there are a lot of jokes about Irish and drinking and stuff. And a lot of that is caricatures, but it is a serious problem, addiction. And so they make a pledge that they'll never drink again, and they'll devote them. They'll never drink at all. It's 16 years old or something. And then they'll also pray to the Sacred Heart in reparation for all the harm done through alcoholism. to families and individuals. And so it's really a powerful devotional. People will make that lifelong pledge as a spiritual commitment. Maybe they've had incidences in their life. This is, but in the New World. So that's my grandfather, and here's my grandmother. Her name is Helen. Helen, her last name is a French family. We have a little bit of French in us on her side. We'd say Tillion, but I think in French it's Toyon. But her father built the home that my dad grew up in for the first 15 years of his life. And so their home, building a home, making a home together as a young couple with a little boy, I think he moved into it. And then the new parish was started 6 months before my father was born in 1919, in St. Agnes Church. So Stan here, where's Stan? Stan is, he and his wife, Jeannie, are from Scottsbluff, Nebraska, so they know that church. But that's our grandmother, Helen, and then my dad is on the right, and his little brother, Pat, is on the left. And then there's another brother they're going to have eventually, who's Bob, named Bob. But this is them. And I'd like to read just a little bit as we look at Helen and her two sons. This was, Dad recollects in here. He has one of these chapters is some highlights from age 7 to 17. I'm just going to read a tiny bit of it, of this section. But his mom taught him the catechism, the Baltimore Catechism, who made you? God made me. Why did God make you? To know, love, and serve him in this world, be happy with him forever the next. So, they're where by rote. But she taught it in a way that he embraced the truth. It wasn't just a memorization exercise for him. He believed it. And he had fond memories of that. Also, in the new parish, the pastor was Father Maloney, taught catechism on certain days, but his mother also did. So here is a part of about his mom, my grandmother. I have a very happy recollection of my mother teaching me my catechism every week at home. She got sick when I was about 7 years old, and I didn't realize how sick she was. She had an inward goiter, Graves' disease, a thyroid issue. There was no real treatment for this condition in 1927, and she died of it. 7 years old, Dad was. I was at a large gathering of people at Morrow's house, and the lady told me my mom had died. I just walked into another room and didn't talk to anyone. I felt very much alone. I went to all the events that occurred after that, but don't remember any real feelings of grief. At the funeral, the casket was open, and my dad held me up so I could kiss her cheek. It was cold and firm, but she was very beautiful and dressed in her nicest new dress. It was lavender, and she held rosary beads in her hands. I mean, isn't it amazing a 7-year-old would remember those details? Yeah. After that, my dad took Bob, Pat, and I to the cemetery every Sunday afternoon to pray and to check the flowers. This was a first experience of real grief, already at a very tender age. Then another incident in here in his early years, he was a newspaper carrier for the Omaha World Herald. And he won a contest with another carrier selling the most papers, and the prize was a free trip to the Chicago World's Fair in 1934. 14 years old, and he and his buddy got on a train without any adults and went to I think it was a direction to Chicago, but then somebody met them there who's hosting all these paper carriers from all over, and you just go, what? Really? Would we do that today? No, I don't think so. Not at all. But he came home, and coming home, there was something unique. That's the first time he'd been away from his family all by himself. And of course, having lost his mother 7 years before. I don't remember the trip home, but I do remember when I came in, my dad gave me such a long, hard hug that I knew he really missed me. I was 14. My brother Bob died that year of his rheumatic fever and Bright's disease. He was 10. Pat, my other brother, older brother, so Dad was the oldest, then Pat, then Bob. Pat continued to be bedridden, and we had nurses around the clock in our home. Pat also had Bright's disease. So again, it was a hard, difficult life. Yoko, could you please hand me my water? So, he was, thank you very much. So, these things are formative. This picture is of my grandfather, A.B., and then my dad standing on the right. And this is before little Bob died, but Pat is the middle kid. And this is just them standing outside. Somebody said, "Oh, is that a cross at a cemetery?" And I said, "No, that's clothesline in the backyard. That's how you did the drying of the laundry in that would have been 33 or earlier." Yeah, so, wearing the overalls. But this brings us to the key event. This chapter of his memoirs is entitled "The Event That Changed My Life the Most." It was the summer of 1935. I was 15 years old and had been nominated by my Boy Scout troop, number 7, to be their representative at the National Jamboree to be held in Washington, D.C. that year. Now, he's going to do a lot of traveling as a teenager. That was the 25th anniversary of the Boy Scouts of America. I had a job sorting beans and was making $1 a day in the job, and I also had a paper route. One Sunday morning, I got dressed and came downstairs and found some grown-up people in our living room. One was Bill Stafford, the banker, and another was Mrs. York, the neighbor to the north and then our housekeeper, the nanny. We called her Auntie Christ, as well as some other people. Antichrist. I was told by someone in a low, subdued voice that my dad had been in a bad accident during the night and that he was in the hospital. I wanted to go see him right away, but someone suggested that my brother Pat and I should go to Mass first. This is a Catholic family. They know that that's important. Go to Mass first and then to the hospital. As it was about time for Mass, we started anyway. It was about time for Mass to start anyway. We did go to Mass, and I prayed for Dad at that time. Then we went to the hospital, and the first thing my dad said to me was, "I guess I just did what I've been telling you not to do all these months that you have been driving." His voice was so weak, and he looked so small in all of those sheets and pillows with a leg and body cast on him. The hospital smelled of ether and disinfectant and looked so cold and sterile. I didn't even think that he might die, and I didn't understand about the injuries he had had. But I did learn later that he'd had a compound fracture of the right femur and had lost a 2-inch fragment from the middle of that femur. He had lost a lot of blood and had several blood transfusions. He and Dr. Phipps had driven to Alliance, Nebraska. Dr. Phipps was Scottsbluff, one of the town doctors, medical doctors. They driven to Alliance, Nebraska that evening, and on the way home, they hit a bridge railing and it damaged the car and caused Dad's injuries. Dr. Phipps had been working on Dad in surgery all night long. They both had been drinking before the accident, and maybe Dad fell asleep at the wheel. So imagine, the town dentist and the town doctor out drinking, come back, single car accident. Town doctor kind of, comes to clarity, starts doing, immediate first aid. Then somehow they got to the hospital, and then he's doing this surgery on the one, who was a passenger, or the driver, I guess. Anyway, I would visit Dad every day, and I got another job at a meat market helping out cleaning up. Dad had lots of complications later on, such as gas gangrene and osteomyelitis. This was long before any antibiotics were available. I really didn't know enough to be worried. I just did my jobs, and Antichrist took care of Pat and me, took care of Pat and me. Pat was an invalid in those days and not able to go to school. He had Bright's disease. The Boy Scout Jamboree was canceled that summer because of a polio epidemic in Washington, D.C. School started the day after Labor Day, and I was a junior that year. I went out for football, and I participated in a school play named Me, Him, and I. I did all the things that high school kids do. I went on dates, to the movies, and school dances. My dad got better and came home in a hospital bed with round-the-clock nurses. His friends came over to play poker with him once a week. There must have been an awful lot of things I didn't know anything about, but I did know that my little brother Pat was seriously ill with Bright's disease and not able to go to school. He also required a lot of nursing care. Dad also told at different times that sometimes my grandfather's buddies would sneak him alcohol because, the nurse doesn't want you to drink any alcohol. Well, what she doesn't know. So they thought they were helping, but not. After Christmas, my dad got worse, and his ulcer began to bleed. He had an ulcer probably exacerbated by the drinking or caused by the drinking. It's not known. I remember Dr. Phipps calling for a consultation. Dr. Best from Omaha, Nebraska, came out on a train to consult. My dad was having lots of blood transfusions, and there were several members of the family from eastern Nebraska there visiting a lot. So he was bleeding so much internally, they couldn't keep blood in him. My Aunt Laura was there. My Uncle Lee was there, and occasionally other aunts and uncles. There was one Saturday afternoon on January 19th, 1936. My dad was sleeping all the time. My Uncle Lee and I were in the room alone, and the nurse would look at my dad and call his breathings Shane Stokes. Is that correct? Shane Stokes, yeah. It's a kind of a breathing where you breathe rapidly and then nothing, and then breathe rapidly again when somebody is close to death. He had that Shane Stokes respiration. Then one time his breathing stopped altogether. And my Uncle Lee and I knelt down by the bed and said one Our Father, 3 Hail Marys, and the nurse pulled the sheet over his face. My dad was 44. My life changed immensely after that. I went to live with my bachelor Uncle Lee and the family in Auburn, Nebraska, clear on the opposite side of the state of Nebraska. Auburn is in the east side, and Scottsbluff is in the west side of the long state. My brother Pat died in March of that year. He was 9 years old. I finished the rest of the junior year and all of my senior year in a boarding school, Moore Hill, in Atchison, Kansas, and worked in the family lumber yard in the summertime. That event is going to come out into play for a lot of things, important decisions my dad's going to make later. But he was all alone. He'd lost everyone. He was the only one who survived his family. And then he went to live with Aunt Laura. And his Aunt Laura was so good to him, and Uncle Lee, his bachelor uncle, and Laura was married to Uncle Ed Ely. They had a bunch of kids, a lot of boys, so it was a good situation, that they took him in, and he's always been grateful, had always been grateful for that. So they cared for him. Here's a picture of Uncle Lee. It's a little in the shade, but Uncle Lee's to the right. Got a little bit of a beer gut on him. But Uncle Lee was also alcoholic. And you'll hear that come into play in another chapter here. Dad went to this boarding school at Moore Hill in Atchison, Kansas. That was a boys' boarding school, and there were some boys from town. Then there was another school in town, a girls' school called Mount St. Scholastica. And Mount St. Scholastica also had boarding school and townies, the kids who lived in town. One of those townies was a local girl named Clara Jane Mangelsdorf. But everybody called her Tops. And that's my mom. That's our mom, Clara Jane. This is when they met. High school. Look at those big eyes on her. So they met and, dating, and they went to junior prom. And no, he didn't go, I don't think they went to junior prom. I think he still had a girlfriend in Scottsbluff. He went back for that. But, he realized after being gone for a long time, she wasn't quite as interested in him as she used to be, this gal in Scottsbluff. So I think he then got more interested in Mom. Now, our Aunt Laura, who took care of Dad, and my mom's mom, my grandmother, her name was Belle Mangelsdorf. They were friends. They knew each other from childhood. And so Aunt Laura wrote to Belle and said, I got a nephew who's going to be at Moore Hill, and occasionally could you have him over for a home-cooked meal? And she, of course we will, And so our grandmother went up to our mom and said, so, we're thinking, my friend has a nephew here, and we're thinking of inviting this boy to dinner. Is that, you okay with that? A boy? So, yeah, it kind of worked out. But something else happened during that high school time. Dad was on a high school retreat, and it was a silent retreat. Moore Hills and also Mount St. Scholastica. They're run by Benedictine monks for the boys, and of course Benedictine nuns. And there was a silent retreat. Again, Dad's 16, just lost everybody in his family, and he had time to think and ponder, and what's this all mean? And he realized, and this was one of those focal moments in all of this, he realized, I've lost everything. I've lost everything a person would think of as their security. And his next thought was, the only thing I have left is my faith. My faith in God. So he made a commitment at that day, age 16, to pray every day that he never loses his faith. Because he thought, if I lose my faith, then I'll be completely lost. And he kept that to the day he died. Never took it for granted. Prayed consciously that I will never lose my faith. I encourage you to think about that. I was telling this story at Dad's funeral, and he died in 2005. And Archbishop Vlasny was there, and he says, I've never thought of doing that. What a great idea. And so he started from that day, praying that he would never lose his faith. Just because you're an archbishop or a priest or a strong Catholic, nothing is guaranteed. We need to continually pray for the gift of faith. So it was a profound conversion experience. Back to time in Scottsbluff. This next chapter, I'm going to read it in sections, but this one is called My Interest in Alcohol and Alcoholism. It's a little longer, but I'm going to, change the pictures out here and there. In my childhood years, I do recall Dad serving mixed drinks to his friends at social events that occurred at our house. I remember lots of loud talking at those times, and the women giggling and high-pitched voices. I don't remember anybody ever being drunk, though. My first experience was when I was awakened from sleep in my bed in the upstairs hallway. They had his brothers had the bedrooms. They put a bed in the hallway for my dad. And, you got to fit everybody somehow. So he was sleeping there. My dad was inching his way past me in the narrow hall that night. He was completely dressed and holding a bottle of whiskey in one hand. I saw him standing and weaving in the dark shadows and heard him say in his slurred speech, "I'm sorry I woke you up." Immediately, I was awake. and I could see him staggering and swaying, and I felt a deep, sick, nauseating feeling in the pit of my stomach. I said, "Dad, you're drunk." After that, I don't remember ever talking to my dad about drinking, but I do remember the many times he slurred his speech in the evening or spilled food on his vest at the dinner table. I remember being embarrassed at that time if there was a guest eating dinner with us when he did that. I don't remember ever being neglected as a child or abused by my dad. Drinking probably contributed to his peptic ulcer disease, and it did cause the auto accident in July of 1935 that ultimately led to his death January 19th of 1936. So these, it just became a normal part of their routine. When we went to see the house that our great-grandfather, Grandpa Tillian, built, we were on a trip out in the Midwest, and we thought we'd just go by and see the house he grew up in. He looked at this one window, and he said, "Many was a lonely night. I stood at that window looking down, just waiting for Dad to come home." And he'd see him get out of the car and stagger to the house, just not sure what to think of all that. Now, this picture is the dad in high school. And he's standing in the middle is Father Daniel, probably a Benedictine monk. He didn't say much about him, but this is when they were at Moore Hill, the Benedictine high school. And on the right is Pete Dunn. Now, Pete Dunn was interested in priesthood at that stage, but he's a great athlete, and they just really clicked because Pete had also lost his dad a few years before. So they had something in common. They could talk to each other. They helped each other out in school and in sports, the things that Pete was great at. He coached my dad on how to get better at that. So they loved hanging out together. A lot of great stories. Pete went on to become a priest, Father Pete Dunn. And many of you are familiar with the story of Boys Town in Nebraska. Pete was a director of Boys Town for a while. And then became Monsignor Pete Dunn. Father Charles knows him because he was a priest of Archdiocese of Omaha, Nebraska. And he's very well known as just being a friendly, gregarious, fine pastor. And I got to meet him just one time when we went back to my mom's 50th high school reunion. And I was just ordained by that time. And Monsignor Dunn wanted to see this, his friend's son who's a priest. It was really nice. So this next section of this story is from these high school years, summer, just beginning of summer break. It doesn't involve Father Daniel or Pete Dunn, but a cousin of my dad's who must have also been at Moore Hill. A cousin, Buzz Ely, who actually was a pretty good athlete himself, went on to play at Notre Dame. So our family have always been Notre Dame fans for football. Go Irish. Yeah, go Irish. My first personal exposure to alcohol was when I was in boarding school at Moore Hill in Atchison, Kansas. The school year had been completed, and I was spending the night at St. Benedict's College is in town, and St. Benedict's College dormitory with my cousin, Buzz Ely. Aunt Laura was planning to pick us up the next morning and drive to Auburn on Saturday. So Buzz said to me, "Let's go across the bridge into Missouri tonight, and we can do some gambling." It was legal to gamble and drink in Missouri. We decided to go over there, and we walked all the way to the bridge and paid 50-cent bridge toll to go across. Buzz bought a pint of Four Roses whiskey and said, "Here, take a sip." I did. I cashed my $10 bill and got 50-cent pieces. I stuck one in my watch pocket so that I wouldn't go completely broke. We had been playing craps and sipping on the Four Roses. It wasn't long before I lost all of my money, and it wasn't long until I got very sick. I went to the restroom and vomited. I tried to get Buzz to go home with me, but he would not leave. Finally, I was so sick that I left all by myself and staggered to the bridge. When the toll taker asked me for money, I said, "I don't have any money. I lost it all gambling." He said, "That's the trouble with you young sprouts. You go across the bridge and you gamble and get drunk and then expect to get back for free. I'm sorry, I can't let you go without paying toll." I thought about my appearance alone, that my appearance would influence him to let me go back. How could, he could see how sick I was, and the more I argued, the more I realized he wasn't ever going to change his mind. I finally dug into my watch pocket and gave him my last 50 cents, and he let me go across. I had to stagger all the way home to the dormitory because I couldn't afford a 25-cent taxi fare. Could you imagine? This is before Uber. When I got there, I couldn't find the room that Buzz was in, so I fell asleep in somebody else's empty bed. The next thing I know, Buzz was waking me up and Aunt Laura was already there. That was a good lesson for me, and it lasted for a few years. I didn't drink very much in college, but in medical school days, there were lots of drinking parties at the fraternity. We would frequently go out on Friday nights to Nally Bo's for beer. I used to figure that if we were all there together and not studying together, I probably would not be getting about too far behind the others in the medical classwork. There was an alcoholic doctor from Auburn whose name was Dr. McAleer. He said he used to be on the Phi Chi, there's a fraternity, medical fraternity. He used to be a Phi Chi member, and he would come to Omaha on some occasions and get drunk and pass out on this downstairs sofa in the Phi Chi house. He was an embarrassment to us all. I remember I used to worry and wonder if I would become an alcoholic like my dad, or Dr. McAleer, and Uncle Lee, and my grandpa Kerns. Even at the time, I thought I could pick out the real heavy drinkers at my fraternity house that were all potential alcoholics. As an intern then at St. Joe's Hospital during my senior year in med school, there was a patient who was a priest that was admitted under a fictitious name on 2 or 3 different occasions. He would be there just to dry out for several days and then be discharged. There was also a wealthy lumberman who was admitted in alcoholic hallucinosis, who jumped out of the 5th floor window on that occasion and died as a result of the injuries. I told Uncle Lee about this man because he knew him as a friend and a businessman. I had hoped this news might deter Uncle Lee from drinking, but it didn't seem to have any effect. You know, just see all the experiences, seeing different people with alcoholism and seeing the damage and how it's fatal. You know, those are making impressions. Those are starting to form a person and how you understand this disease. This next picture is during the Navy. Dad was the day after Pearl Harbor. He signed up with all his buddies. They went down to the recruitment office, and he joined the Navy because he couldn't imagine how you keep a wound clean in a foxhole. So he thought, if you're in the Navy, you get sick bay or something. That's his dog tag there. Dancing with Mom. You know, he's a Lieutenant JG at that. I don't remember much of a problem with alcoholism during the war years, but I do remember returning to the ship on the motor launch in one occasion. We were returning from a Liberty in Bermuda, and there in the center of the launch was a large number of vomiting, sick, and bleeding sailors being returned to their ships. I turned to a friend of mine and said, "One of those ship's doctors is going to be very busy tonight." As it turned out, I was the doctor. I was busy sewing up wounds far into the night. I didn't deal with alcoholics much during the war years. My first exposure after the war was during my practice in Grants Pass. Mom and Dad moved here to Grants Pass. Dad had a shipmate in his cabin, another officer on the destroyer he was on, who was from Bend, Oregon, constantly talking about how beautiful the Pacific Northwest is. And so that's one of the reasons they moved to Oregon. The only recollection I have of treating an alcoholic patients in Grants Pass was sewing up some wounds in the emergency room for people that had been in alcohol-related accidents. Next picture. I'll read the caption. In 1960, when Tops was pregnant with Pete, the youngest in our family, Pioneer Pike was annexed into the city of Eugene. We have a picture of the census taker who was a fireman adding our names to the city census. The Eugene Register-Guard, the local paper, had an article with a headline that said, "Eugene hits the jackpot." So there's 7 of us. To the far left at the top is my sister Patricia over here, high school, and our sister Jane, and then My brother Tom, he's the oldest. He's probably a senior this year. And he's holding me. And then down there, my brother Bob and my sister Mary Kay, and in the middle, where my mom's hands are on the shoulders of our brother Will. And some of them all still live in Eugene. So these are things that happened in Eugene. I came to Eugene in 1949. I remember one occasion when I was called by a patient of mine named Anna to come and see her husband. And this is in the days of house calls, okay? He apparently had been drinking. They lived in an apartment that they rented from Bill Bristow. Bill Bristow had a jewelry store in town. Everybody knew him. I went out and talked to Buzz and then called AA. 2 AA men met me at Buzz's in Anna's house, and we talked. They knew what they were talking about. I couldn't tell that they didn't. I could tell because he's always said people in AA, they know how to talk to alcoholics. Some of you folks are friends of Bill here, part of the AA community. He said I could tell that they didn't pull any punches. They were down to earth, very honest in everything they said to him. I knew they knew more about alcoholism than I did. One of these men was Mac Cawthorn, the guy Dad worked with a lot, whom I have come to know very well in all these years. And the other was Doc Branford, a dentist who died a few years after that visit. After the visit, Buzz went to AA. He found sobriety for a while, but ultimately died of his disease. He gave me his big AA book. This is the blue book. Anybody a friend of Bill knows the blue book. Usually you don't have the cover on anymore, and it's all written up and marked up inside. But this is the Alcoholics Anonymous Bible, if you will. That's the blue book. So he got that blue book. This book gave me insight into alcoholism that I had never learned in medical school. Alcoholics Anonymous was only about 15 years old at that time. I began to call Mac Cawthorn, whenever I had an alcoholic patient. He and other AA members began to send friends to me for treatment. I went to some AA meetings and I learned that alcoholism is a deceitful, destructive disease. The alcoholic often doesn't even know when he is lying. The only alcoholic you can believe is the one who has been living in recovery for quite some time. I learned to pick out those alcoholics in recovery and depend on them greatly in dealing with alcoholic patients. I joined the Lane County Council on Alcoholism and took an active part in that council. Levin gave me lectures and held open meetings every week in that courthouse. George Buckley came to town about that time and opened the Buckley House, a detox center in Eugene. And I saw many alcoholic patients that were there detoxifying in his house. It was a facility. He called me for medical problems that they were having. I sent a few patients to Raleigh Hills for treatment, which was a residential treatment center in Beaverton that used to use the aversion therapy of the time. That was people weren't in AA. They just thought, well, this kind where if you take this medication and if you drink alcohol, it reacts very badly and you get violently ill. And so it's a deterrent, but it doesn't deal with the underlying issues. So Dad never thought much of that, but there weren't many options. I knew a lot of AA members, and on one occasion in 1972, Bob Sorens brought Sam Graves to my office and introduced us. Sam was an alcoholic counselor, also recovering alcoholic himself, from a live-in residential treatment center in Mandan, North Dakota. It was called Heartview. He happened to be visiting Eugene at the time. We talked all afternoon in my office. Can you imagine? He cleared his afternoon. And learned that there were AA-oriented residential treatment centers around the country. Aversion therapy was not the only therapy available. I was so excited about what he told me that I planned to stop off at Mandan during a trip I planned to Washington, D.C., where I was going for a Job Corps convention. Dad used to work on a sideline doing Job Corps histories and physicals. I stayed at Heartview 2 days. I sat in Sam's group therapy. I heard some of the lectures. I saw how the detoxification was done. I met Dr. Garderbrink, who was the executive director at the time, and got a thumbnail sketch on how Heartview operated. After returning to Eugene, from that time, I was constantly thinking about and planning to open a treatment center like Heartview in Eugene. I invited some friends, some public figures, AA members, interested people to come to a series of meetings to bring this about. People like John Jacqua, Matt Cawthorn, this alcoholic he worked with a lot, recovery guy, AA guy. Jack O'Connor, Phil Maher. Phil's daughter Colleen Gardner is part of our parish. So her dad Phil, was part of this, just, think tank of business people getting together. How do you do this? How do you put a business plan together? Including Lois O'Connor, Jack Quigley, and many, many others. So these are the folks who were just trying to figure, there's got to be a way to figure this out. And so here's just a picture of Dad and Sam Graves, and then Lois O'Connor. They're considered the founders of Serenity Lane. Out of those meetings, we got the name Serenity Lane. It's from the Serenity Prayer in Lane County. That's what it is, Lane County, because that's where they started. We developed a constitution and bylaws, got Sam Graves to agree to come out and set up the program. Sam had kids that were little. Dad had not built a building, had not acquired a building. He had an idea. Sam left a good job in Mandan, North Dakota. I mean, his son, Kevin Graves, who does interventions. Kevin's amazing. Mike knows Kevin. Kevin told me, you have no idea. This is not time to be making on some pipe dream, that we the hope this thing works out is just an idea. They hadn't even raised all the money yet. So these are people of faith. Sam is a very strong Christian in his whole life, very devout. Though he believed in God and the power of prayer, as did my dad. They still had to establish fundraising. And then they bought an abandoned fraternity house on 16th and Patterson, and it was a dump. It had been, squatters were living in there, and it was gross. I remember going in there, a bunch of us as high school kids, and we helped clean it up and paint it, and it was, ugh. The bathrooms alone. It was disgusting, but that's what we did. He got an architect to volunteer his services to remodel, voluntary builders, painters, and plumbers to make it ready. I also got the Carmelite nuns to pray for us, the Carmelites in Eugene. They are huge prayer allies in our family. And applied to the IRS for the status as a not-for-profit institution. We sent Mary Ann Lilly back to Mandan to learn nursing procedure. Now, he kind of shorthand here. He didn't explain. Mary Ann was his office nurse. And so he's asking her to take another job, on this other thing. It's kind of a new thing. I hope it works, Mike McCallum knows Mary Ann. We grew up with those kids. Mary Ann was amazing. Oh, man, and funny. But we got Mary Ann to run it. You need a strong nurse who's going to make sure all the medical stuff is happening, right? And she got a lot of experience there, studying at Mandan and then learning from their procedures, and many other people were involved. And finally, we opened for business May 3rd, 1973, 50 years ago, this coming May. We had 2 female patients and 1 male patient, and Sam Graves was the whole program. Now you got all kinds of counselors and medical staff and psychiatric staff, mental health, janitorial. But at that time, Sam. He held all the group's therapies and gave us all lectures. We struggled financially for several years. There was another treatment center in town, and every time we drive past that place, Dad would count the cars in the parking lot because that's the competition. And they were doing aversion therapy, and he just, that's not the right thing. Under the direction of Sam Graves, Lois O'Connor, Mary Ann Lilly, and myself, Serenity Lane came into existence. There were many, many ups and downs in the early years of the program. The treatment program lasted 8 weeks in the beginning. Can you imagine? Now they pay for 28 days if you're lucky. The insurance will only cover that, but it's not as good. It's not as good. You need more time. The treatment program lasted 8 weeks at the beginning. We had trouble paying the bills and the salaries that first few years and had to depend on donations for that. It helped a lot financially when the state legislature mandated insurance coverage for alcoholism. This is early in the history of treatment of alcoholism. Then we were able to get more patients admitted. That's a game changer. Our success rate in the early years was about 90% for quite a long time. The staff was very positive, resourceful, and dedicated. As the practice of medicine changed, the HMOs reduced the amount of treatment provided and the success rate began to drop. We had some problems in the early days of the board of directors. Now, Mike McCallum and I are both on the board of directors now. We could be problems sometimes. Yeah. As time went, but they did have some very complicated things going on. I'm about ready to wrap up here. As time went on, we were able to make adjustments. In later years, the board was much more effective. As time went on, more women came in for treatment, and the younger and younger patients were admitted. New drugs became available, and those addictions had to be addressed. Right now, it's just the narcotics are so much more devastating than alcohol, but it's all tragic and a difficult struggle. Research was progressing rapidly, and addictive disease became much better understood. Counseling techniques changed, not always for the better. I retired from family practice at the Eugene Clinic in 1987 and began to work full-time on alcoholism and drug addiction at Serenity Lane until 1996. I retired from Serenity Lane at the time and continued as the director of the Buckley House until 97. Serenity Lane had their 25th anniversary in May of 1998. So that's a time in the history of how Serenity Lane began. Now, in his picture, that's Marianne Lilly on the bottom right. This is from the website for Serenity Lane. It just mentions that in '73 this all started. In the field of addiction and as behavioral change has grown exponentially, the middle paragraph, in the last 50 years, that we're celebrating this year, 50 years. While Serenity Lane has fine-tuned its programming along the way, it's never strayed from that warm, accessible, and homegrown environment that has offered comfort and shelter now for up to 68,000 souls who've been able to go there and find hope. They haven't all recovered, of course, but they at least walked in that door. And as Mike was telling me earlier, when you think about this, we talk about this a lot at Serenity Lane. You're not just saving the addict, you're saving the whole family. Because the whole family is sick, the damage that's done. And some of the worst stuff is what these family members experience than the addict, him or herself. So it really, 68,000 souls, that's 300,000 people when you think of the family who all are impacted by the good that can be done. So when we look at Serenity Lane now, I'll show you a picture of the current CEO. That's our brother Pete Kerns. Pete was chief of police, his whole career in law enforcement, and then he retired from law enforcement after being the chief for 8 years. And then he worked for St. Vincent de Paul Society of Lane County, and then heard that there was an opening because the CEO was retiring, and Pete, jumped at the chance, and he was brought in with great acclaim because he just is an incredible administrator. I mean, I'm biased, but Mike thinks so too. But so he's now doing that good work there. And so here's a picture of the facility today, because it's no longer at the fraternity house, but the property, the old frat house, which was surrounded by frat houses, which was surrounded by frat parties, and drunk frat guys said, "Hey, over there in the fence, do you want a beer?" They were reaching it over the top of the fence. Aren't we funny? So here's what it looks like now. And it's like on a campus that looks kind of like a retreat center. So it's an excellent location. It was they envisioned this long before I was on the board, but it's really served extremely well. So that's Serenity Lane now. We're going to be celebrating our 50th anniversary. But here's a little you got to see some family pictures, right? So I go home to visit, and my parents both died in the early 2000s. But this is before, probably in the 90s. And I'm home, and we're just having dinner there. I was much younger. And in the background, you can see her. That's my sister Patricia over at the counter. We were both home and having dinner with Mom and Dad. But this is when you think of all our siblings, and then their spouses, and then their children and grandchildren. that was taken the year that Dad died, So that was his last birthday. We celebrated Mom's and Dad's birthday together that January, and Dad was born in December. But that was quite an occasion. Our brother Bob's a professional photographer and took a picture. So just some closing remarks, and I know I've gone longer than Tom thought. But when Dad died, we had these funeral cards made up, and we took a quote from the first volume of his memoirs talking about the importance of prayer, because all of this life was a work of faith. His faith was foundational. I mean, remember that story, and you recognize that's the only important thing that any of us have. So he wrote this, and we put it on the back of his memorial funeral card. Every wonderful thing that I have in this life is an answer to my prayer. My sweet wife, my wonderful kids, my wonderful grandkids, my acceptance into medical school at the age of 19, my graduation from med school, my return from the war, my success in the field of medicine, as well as all the other facets of my life, all are answers to my prayers. All the good that came out of the life of Dr. Tom Kerns was a huge blessing to a lot of people. Those hundreds of thousands who are impacted when somebody finds their way to recovery. It's important to note this. The good that happened through him or in his life was not in spite of bad things that happened before, but rather it was because of the bad things that happened. That's an important point, because he had lost the family of his youth. Had those things not happened, had he not lost all his family members, he would never have gone to high school in Atchison. He would never have met my mom. He would have never had all his wonderful kids and grandkids. He might have gone to med school, probably would have gone to med school, but would not have pursued treatment of alcohol and substance use disorder. I mean, those is because of his painful experiences. It motivated him, and also God directed all of that. See, as Christians will always say, the resurrection always follows the cross. The resurrection always follows the cross. The resurrection of Jesus did not happen in spite of the cross, but because of the cross. In God's plan, blessing can always come forth from suffering and hardship, not in spite of, but because of. May that truth guide us on our journeys of hope, mercy, and grace. Thank you very much.